streaming to Facebook, as well as the Zoom broadcast of people who registered for the webinar today. So let's get underway. I'm Terry Ryder, the founder of Hotspotting, and today I'm having a discussion with our guest presenter Miriam Sandkuhler about some of the important topics which are top of mind, or should be, for real estate consumers across Australia. Our core topic is buying in changing times, and no one can deny that times are a-changing. The level of change in the last 3 months has been extraordinary, most of it positive for real estate markets, but interspersed with one or two negatives. It's a whole new dynamic out there for buyers and sellers, especially in our larger cities. We have a high demand, low supply situation in the largest cities and some of our regional centres. And we're going to talk about how to adapt to that new situation. Miriam's also going to speak about a couple of the negatives that are out there in the market, including the dangers presented by spruikers and marketeers misrepresenting themselves to real estate consumers, and also about the problems with new apartment buildings. Stay tuned until the end of the webinar because there will be a special offer. And also be aware that we invite your questions, and you can type your comments or your questions into either the chat box or the Q&A panel that you should see in front of you, and we'll deal with as many questions as we can towards the end of today's broadcast. And now to our guest presenter. Today, Miriam Sandkuhler is an award-winning buyer's agent and also a best-selling author of a very good book on real estate investment called Property Prosperity. And she's right there at the coalface of the real estate industry, representing the interests of real estate consumers every single day. Miriam, welcome.
Thanks for having me again, Terry.
So over to you. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So for anyone who isn't familiar with me or my business, Property Mavens, we are an integrated property advocacy firm. We work with buyers and vendors offering buyer advocacy and vendor advocacy services. And our role is to help clients buy and sell smart, and therefore enabling them to move into the next stage of their life seamlessly while also achieving the outcomes that they're after. Now, we buy what I call high-performing investment-grade homes and investment properties. We help people find the right property for their budget, and we help people sell their property as well for the right price with the right agent. So personally, I'm a licensed real estate agent working as a buyer's advocate. So buyers engage me and I legally represent their interests and work on their behalf. I'm also an accredited property investment advisor, which is a little bit like a financial planner for direct property only. And again, best-selling author, media commentator, and lots of award nominations and wins there as well. So as Terry said, we're going to be talking about buying in a changing market, some charlatan buyer agents that are out there, and what's going on with the apartment building cracking crisis at the moment too. So let's talk about the marketplace, but also let's talk about how a lot of people buy. So frequently mistakes come from people wanting to buy easily and quickly. Often they'll attend education seminars for expert tips, they read magazines and property books, but if their property book's based on one strategy only, that's half the story. If they don't talk about both sides and risk, well then there's a problem with that. People join investor clubs for apparent wholesale discounts which really don't exist. There are property institutes or coaches who could be charging $10,000 for education but not delivering guaranteed outcomes. Of course, there are property developers, project marketers, property spruikers that have been rife in the market selling these off-the-plan apartments where there's now a building crisis that's resulted as a consequence of that. And a lot of these people are being sent referrals by mortgage brokers, financial planners and accountants where they're getting kickbacks, commissions and referral fees, again with often dire consequences for their clients. So be very aware if you're dealing with any advisors who are referring you to people to buy new or off the plan. They're making enormous amounts of money and they're potentially sending you down the river. As Terry said, I've got 3 chapters in my book that talks about risk and strategy and risk profiling that I'm going to offer. So hang in there at the end and I'll talk about how you can download those chapters. So the current market, as Terry said, buyers are battling for stock as the shortage hits, and this is evident in metro and regional areas, and particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Certainly, you can see here that Sydney's July listings were down 32% year on year, and levels have also fallen in Melbourne, which is down 30% year on year, Brisbane 20%, Adelaide 7%. Now, clearance rates are the highest since spring 2016, and that's an absolute consequence of high demand and low supply, and some of the lowest supply we've had in a really long time. So what you need to consider when you're going into this market, obviously there isn't a single market. You've got different suburbs in cities that have stronger levels of supply and demand than others. And it also comes down to, are you buying an A grade, a B grade or a C grade property? Now, A grade properties are those ones that outperform the market. They're the top 5% that will generate higher capital growth at a higher and faster rate, and they tend to hold their value better during a downturn, and they have attributes that can deem them to be investment grade, or rather A grade. Then you've got your B and your C grade, who come in just below those types of properties. They're not as highly sought after necessarily. They still grow in value, but maybe not at the same rate. So depending on whether you're buying an A, B or a C grade will determine the strategy that you're looking at. The amount of stock in the market of that A, B or C grade will also go to determining your strategy. A grade properties, you know, certainly you might need to be very aggressive in the manner in which you're trying to buy it. Maybe you have to go to auction. You've got to really apply a strong bidding strategy. And if you don't have experience, working with an expert will make a difference. B and C grade properties, there might be the capacity to negotiate really good deals if you don't have strong demand on those particular property types, and you might be able to buy really well or buy before auction or buy below market. And then, of course, there's everything in between. So we don't have time to talk about that at great length, but just understand price point is an issue. You know, if you're buying under 750,000, you're competing with first-time buyers, investors, and in some cases, cashed-up downsizers. We're looking at a lot of upgraders in the metro area between that $1 and $2 million mark. Sometimes they're first-time buyers as well, and sometimes they're downsizers. So you might have someone selling a 6-bedroom, $3 million home who wants to downsize into a 3-bedroom or 2-bedroom terrace home in that price point. So just be aware that you're competing with that as well. So buying and bidding strategy always determines success. Knowing how to price a property correctly will also determine success. So I deal with all the buyers all the time, and a lot of people say, I want to pay X for it. But the thing is, there are 3 prices. There's the price you want to pay as a buyer. There's the price that we appraise the property at in the market, and there's a price that you need to pay if you're up against a lot of competition and emotional buyers. And if you don't understand what that final price is, then you can rest assured that you're probably going to continue missing out. And if we're back into a market where those A-grade properties are starting to escalate in price again, the cost of missing out and then finding another property and eventually getting back in will often far be higher than the cost of getting a professional to help you. So I honestly suggest talk to your local buyer's agent or buyer's advocate, and they'll explain to you how they can best assist you. Now, this brings us to the next part of our presentation about the term buyer's agent or buyer advocate is often being misused and abused. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors going on, and there's a lot of new stuff that's been happening in the marketplace, which is causing a lot of those of us who've been doing this for a long time, a lot of concern, particularly for consumers. So you need to watch out for double agents. They're agents in the marketplace who are 1 minute trying to tell you that they'll buy your property for you, but then on the next hand, they're trying to actually sell your property. So 1 minute they're asking you for money to help them buy, and then the next minute they're being paid for a vendor. So this constant changing of hats is usually a conflict of interest, and I would suggest that you run a mile from anyone who's trying to play that kind of game with you. The reality is these double agents are often selling agents who are dipping their toe into buyer advocacy because they think they know what it is. But the fact of the matter is selling is very transactional and buyer advocacy is very consultative. So if you're dealing with a selling agent who works in a transactional manner but calls themselves a buyer's advocate, you can rest assured they're probably going to want to turn you over quite quickly and get you an outcome. They might use their selling strategies on you to push you into something or sell you something that may not be right for you because they're doing what they think buyer advocacy is, but they only understand the transactional process. They don't understand everything leading up to that. And that's the experience that I see in the marketplace, because we've also got a lot of selling agents transitioning into this side of the business as well. And many of them think they know what buyer advocacy is, and in fact, they often don't. This is an example of some confusing messaging and marketing. So this is where the term buyer and vendor advocate or buyer and vendor agent is being creatively used. So this is a high-profile agency. They have internal marketing awards. This is their internal marketing where, you know, they're handing out awards for agents who had the most number of ratings from vendors or the most number of ratings from buyers. But if you're going to get an email signature like this, for the consumer, it's incredibly confusing because you don't have that knowledge to understand that this is a marketing award, not actually a reflection of the job that they do. So just be really careful if you're seeing any of this stuff. The fact of the matter is this is a selling agency. They don't offer vendor advocacy services. They don't offer buyer's advocacy services. But by looking at this, you can understand why people would be really confused. And to a degree, yes, it's potentially misleading, but that's for them to be concerned about. I make no further comment on that. The other thing is understanding licensing and how selling agents and buyer agents go about being licensed. So I originally did my agents rep certificate in Victoria, then I went over to Western Australia and I did a diploma of property over a 6-month period to get my full licence. Western Australia has the strongest criteria in the country when it comes to becoming qualified as a licensed agent. And I had to go up in front of a panel of members of the industry to be interviewed to see whether or not I was a person of good character who deserved a licence. In Victoria, it's a little bit different. You get your agent's representative certificate over a 12-month period. You have to be in the industry working under an agent to get mentoring to then be able to go and do your licensing course. And again, that can take 6 months. It's done, you qualify with a certificate for in property, but there's no panel you need to go in front of to be interviewed to see if you're a person of good character for the role. And then if we look at New South Wales, they currently have shorter time frames for licensing. That's due to change. You walk out with a certificate for in property after you can obtain the qualifications. But unfortunately, that can be done in 18 days without necessarily having to have experience on the ground. And also in New South Wales, they do offer a specific buyer's advocacy licence where no other state does that. The biggest concern we have is something called mutual recognition. It's the Mutual Recognition Act. And what it means is that somebody with no experience in Victoria can get the minimum qualification of an agent's rep certificate. Then they can apply in New South Wales for a full licence, which they can be issued within a matter of days and months. And then they come back to Victoria through mutual recognition. They're automatically issued a licence in Victoria, not having undergone the minimum 12 months experience in the industry. And suddenly they're out there doing a job with no experience on the ground. So this happens when people call themselves selling agents. And this happens at the moment where people are calling themselves buyer agents. And worst of all, they're calling themselves experts, yet they've never actually worked in the industry. They've never transacted in real estate. And consumers are coming across these people who are really good at marketing themselves as buyer agents and experts, but they've never actually done the job. So that's really scary for consumers. So what I suggest is make sure if you're dealing with buyer advocates that they have extra qualifications. So you might want to deal with someone such as myself who's an accredited property investment advisor, a qualified property investment advisor, someone who's maybe got a licensed a valuer, that kind of background. They've got a property degree or a property diploma. And you want to deal with someone who's an accredited member of industry associations. So I'm a member of REBA, Real Estate Buyers Agents Association of Australia. I've got the web link up there. I suggest everyone hops on and has a look at that website. And there's lots of tips and information there on how to go about interviewing buyer advocates and ideally only dealing with accredited members, because we have a code of conduct and a code of ethics. We have a very stringent membership application process that everybody has to go through to qualify to be a member. And we're really there to represent consumers on the buying side. That's all that we do. And I would honestly encourage you to only deal with a REBA accredited member because of those protections that are in place for consumers. And you want to make sure that your licensed real estate agent or your licensed buyer advocate is a member of their local real estate industry association. So in my case, I'm a member of the RAIB. Again, they have a code of conduct and ethics that they work to as well. Now, what's also happening in the moment in the industry is there are 5-week online courses out there that you can do from a non-accredited organisation or non-RTO organisation teaching how to be a buyer's agent. But in fact, it doesn't teach you how to be a buyer's agent. It teaches you how to market yourself as a buyer's agent and get a client, but not actually what to do with them once you've got them. So that's really risky. In this sort of situation, somebody else is practicing with your money to learn on the ground how to do their job, but that's putting you and your investment at risk. So you do want to be asking questions. You want to make sure you're dealing with a buyer's advocate that's truly independent. You don't want them linked to a selling agent. Again, that's that double agent we're talking about. The reality is if you've got someone operating out of a high profile brand, and they're calling themselves a buyer's advocate, you can rest assured that they're not an independent buyer's advocate if they're not charging you a fee, And there's always going to be a conflict of interest if they're trying to, you know, recommend stock that the agency has on hand as a listing. So be very careful of that. They need to be full independent. You also want to deal with someone full-time, not someone part-time. Now, the problem with these online courses, it's appealing to people who've never worked in the industry. It's flogging that they can earn a 7-figure income. It's telling them that they can do it part-time, you know, in conjunction with another job. And the reality is you cannot do this job on a part-time basis. If you're not in the market full-time, if you're not building relationships, if you don't understand the dynamics of what's going on, then your client is going to suffer as a result. So make sure you only deal with people who are full-time advocates. They need to have a minimum 2 years industry experience, so they want to have worked as a selling agent or a property manager. And you want to verify that they've got testimonials from full-paying clients, not clients that have been practicing on for free, because there's a bit of that going on as well. You want to ask for case studies, proven track record, and examples of their negotiation successes. You want to make sure they've got clear systems and processes to follow. They've got formal legal agreements to engage you, which clearly map out what their obligations are to you. And, you know, you want to make sure they've got a network of selling agents that they work with, particularly for buyer and vendor advocacy services, because often that's how you as a client are going to benefit working with an advocate to get access to their off-market opportunities based on the relationships they've built with agents for a number of years. They absolutely want to have professional indemnity insurance. That's a question they need to be asking. And if they've got lots of industry awards and recognitions, well, then that's a tick as well in their favour. Now, because those of us that are REBA members are really passionate about protecting consumers, we've started this whole hashtag Ask for Experience. So if you go onto Facebook or LinkedIn and you type in that hashtag, you'll see lots of articles and information designed to help you and protect you. So by all means, feel free to do that. And as I said, be wary of people who've just done an online course. They've never actually bought before. They might have bought one themselves, but that doesn't make you a buyer's advocate. In all honesty, I've franchised my business model. I've done it to bring in people who want to work in advocacy, but I require everyone to have a minimum 2 years sales experience, because if you don't understand how a selling agent and a selling agency works, you cannot be a good buyer's advocate. So the other thing too is people need to work under a buyer's advocate and have mentoring for at least 18 months before they understand how to work as a buyer's advocate, because they actually need somebody overseeing what they're doing and correcting them and adjusting and making sure they're not making mistakes when they're working with clients. And in reality, when I have people in my business who've been selling agents, they have to unlearn how to be a selling agent and then transition and learn how to be a buyer and vendor advocate, because it's a really different mindset. And I know for a fact that there are selling agents who call themselves buyer agents, but they've never unlearnt the sales and they've never learnt the buying, which means they're actually not doing the best they should be doing for their clients. So again, don't let someone practice with your money. Now, I talked before about testimonials. Really make sure that people are giving a really good explanation of the journey that they've had with the professional that they've dealt with. So I have case studies on my website, and these are just some very recent testimonials that I've had from clients. So you want them to be talking about the approach, you want them to talk about the methodology, you want them to talk about experience, you want them to talk about the process, you want them to talk about local knowledge and professionalism. These are the sort of things that you want to be looking for in testimonials to know that you're in fact dealing with an expert that's highly regarded, and you want them to get really high ratings. If somebody can't give you that, it means they've got no experience in it, and I would be very, very careful, and probably, to be honest, I wouldn't deal with them. As I said before, you want to talk about client success stories and case studies. So personally, when I work with a client who wants to build a portfolio of 2 or 3 properties, it's really important that I do buy them investment grade property, because they want to get really strong capital growth so they can use that equity growth to leverage into their next one and their next one. So this is a client who I've worked with over a number of years. When we bought his first property, he had 33% capital growth in 2 years, which is great. I then bought his second property off market and $30,000 under market value. He's had great yield on it for a metro property, and now we're looking at his third property. So again, experience and results determines your capacity to build an ongoing portfolio. And I also spoke before about buying investment grade properties, and these are the ones that outperform the market. So I've got lots of case studies going back, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 years. And this is an example of what I mean. So if we look at, say, Roger, over 4 years, his properties had 51.3% capital growth. whereas the market's averaged 24.2. So that's what I mean by that, outperforming the market. And again, you want to have a look at a lot of these examples when you're talking to or you're interviewing prospective buyer agents, because you need to know that they can deliver proven results. Now, the one thing people always ask me is, can I discount my service? And there's got to be an understanding around price versus value. So I know in the market, when I'm competing with so-called buyer agents with no expertise and not the same skill set as me, usually the only way they can secure a client is to go in cheap on price. And that's a reflection of the fact that maybe you're not dealing with someone who is an expert. So it's about understanding the value delivery of what people are going to bring to the table. So those case studies are really important. Those testimonials are really important. I mean, you can see here on the screen that there's always someone to do it cheaper. But when you're dealing with an asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, if you either do it yourself or you use someone who's not particularly skilled, you will always pay a higher price. And that higher price will be buying a property that possibly doesn't deliver great capital growth. You may not easily be able to tenant it. You may not be able to sell it when you need to down the track. They may not have done the right level of due diligence to protect you along the way. And all sorts of things can go wrong because there are literally 100 steps from the beginning of the process to, buying a property unconditionally, where things can go wrong. And if you don't know what you don't know and you're doing it yourself, that's where people come unstuck. Or you're dealing with someone who's a newbie, they don't have experience, they think it's easy and it's just about sticking your hand up at auction, well then again, that's where it can come unstuck. Now I know as a result of the block, Reba has been vetting lots and lots of phone calls from people about how do I become a buyer's agent. And most people are quite surprised that you actually have to be a licensed real estate agent. You have to start off as an agent's representative. You have to work under a licensed agent, and then if you ever want to go out on your own, you have to be fully licensed yourself. Because legally in this country, you cannot transact in real estate for a client and take a fee if you are not a licensed agent. So what does that mean? Well, if you talk to your accountant tells you they're going to bid for you at auction and charge you a fee, that's not legal. If your mortgage broker offers to stick up their hand and bid for you at auction and charge you a fee, that's also not legal. So you should only be dealing with licensed real estate agents or agents representatives if they're transacting for you and if they're charging you a fee as a buyer's advocate. So let's look at some of the consequences. As I said, you want someone working full-time. You have to have focus in this industry. You can't do it part-time. I heard of a story of a part-time newbie buyer's agent who sent clients off to a real estate agent. She actually was silly enough to give him their contact details. He organised the bookings with them. He showed them 2 properties. They wanted to buy one of them and he couldn't get hold of her because she was busy doing her daytime job, and he wanted to write up the offer but didn't have any instructions from her. Now, she left her client unbelievably vulnerable because she should have A, managed it differently to start with, and B, needed to be available to talk to her clients before they even considered putting an offer down. And all of a sudden she lost control of the situation. The selling agent was in control. That's not what a buyer agent should be doing, and that's not what how a buyer agent should be working. So be careful. The reality is buyer advocacy is actually harder to learn than sales. It is very much one of those jobs you learn on the ground, and you learn under training and close supervision from a mentor and an expert who's already been doing it for a number of years themselves. So again, someone who thinks they can be a selling agent and tomorrow call themselves a buyer's advocate and they think they know everything, unfortunately they don't. And even those that do realise that they don't know enough, because there's no formal way that they can necessarily learn how to do it properly, that's where they can come unstuck as well. And the thing is, you can't train in advance for the unknown. That's where mentoring comes in, and that's where working along an experienced buyer's advocate is really important, so that we are overseeing that individual and they understand what they can do, what they can't do, what they need to think about, where they need to pull back because they're behaving like a selling agent, not a buyer's agent, where they need to push forward because they need to behave like a buyer's advocate, not a selling advocate. So that's really important. Again, if they're not doing adequate due diligence and investigations, that's to the cost of the client. If they don't even understand how to price property or value property, that's a major issue. If they don't understand auction techniques and strategy, that's a huge problem. I had a prospect talk to me recently about one of these newbie competitors in the marketplace, and she asked if he could represent her at auction, and he had to admit that he'd never bought property at an auction before. So, you know, that's not an expert. That's not what you're paying for. Getting it wrong is where you'll pay a substantial price. Again, giving unqualified and unsubstantiated advice is a risk. If you're not being given reports and evidence to support the recommendation that is being made, run a mile, because a good buyer's advocate will know how to substantiate their recommendations and will have evidence on which you can base a decision. The other thing with newbies or selling agents that convert and they're not trained, they don't know what they don't know. So automatically, again, that makes the client vulnerable. Newbies have a lack of negotiation skills. You know, if you 1 minute your profession is a teacher or an Uber driver and next minute you're calling yourself a buyer's agent, well, where is the experience and the training around negotiating? Because you are dealing with really sharp selling agents who've had weekly training on negotiation, extracting information, working with buyers to manipulate the outcome in favour of the vendor. So that's where people are vulnerable. Again, as I said, lack of experience in the role. And yeah, if you're doing it yourself, you can be also relying on unqualified or inexperienced advice from family or friends. So if they're not experts, be wary of going down that path as well. So Terry, there's a fair bit there. Are you still awake?
I'm very awake. I'm tuned in and I'm learning heaps.
I'm going to take a breath now.
Okay. Well, you make the point very strongly. There's just so much to know. I'm interested in your comment that there's actually a lot more to know to be a buyer's advocate than a selling agent, but you do have to start with being a selling agent.
Well, it absolutely helps. You know, it's very hard to teach people how agents and an agency works if they've never actually been in it and understand it, because they all vary, they all do things differently, but there are tricks and tactics and things that they do that if you don't understand that, well, then half your negotiation power's gone and you'll just get played.
You mentioned at the beginning that selling is very transactional and buyer's advocacy is very consultative. So what's the essential difference there?
So look, the reality is when selling agents are helping a vendor sell a property, they usually list a property. If they can put it on an auction campaign, within 4 to 6 weeks that property's sold, they move on to the next one. So it's quite fast paced. The thing about buyer advocacy is I could work with a client brief, and particularly a home buyer when you're looking to help them meet those emotional needs of what they want in a home. You might be looking for 12 or 18 months before you help them buy the right property. So it's not here's a great property, I want you to buy it. You actually have to work with the client, understand what they're after, and then go into the marketplace and find it. The other thing, working with investors, and this is where selling agents get it wrong when they think buyer advocacy is easy, is that, you know, again, it might take months to get a client an outcome from an investment perspective. So there really isn't the capacity to do the same level of volume that a selling agent would do unless you open up a business and have a team of 4 people around you, you know, which is possible. But if you don't know how to be a buyer's agent in the first place and you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know that you've got to be patient, you've got to do potentially 3 times the work. And I say to clients and agents who are looking to become buyer agents, I warn them that there are no shortcuts in this job. The work is what it is. You might work with a client and negotiate on 3 properties before you get them an outcome. And the equivalent of what that is to a selling agent is selling a property 3 times before they get paid for it. And a lot of them don't understand that that's the reality of the job. So those of us that tend to do buyer advocacy are passionate about working with and protecting consumers. We're not in it to make millions of dollars and be a top selling agent with 5,000 deals a year and, you know, getting awards for this and awards for that, because it's all based on volume and how much money you make. That's selling. That's what selling agents do. And that's where, unfortunately, if they think like that coming into buyer advocacy, they burn clients.
Okay. I'm aware that as a buyer's agent or buyer's advocate, there is quite a range of services you provide at different degrees of service. People can engage you simply to go and bid for them at auction, for example, and or the full service and lots of shades of grey in between.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if someone finds a property, they do all their due diligence, but they don't have auction bidding experience or strategy, it can be really intimidating and emotional. So they can engage a buyer's advocate just for that. Or if they find a property that don't know how to analyse or assess it to see if it's investment grade or not compromised, then they can engage a buyer's agent to do assess and negotiate. Or they can work with a buyer's agent who they can either provide a brief to, or if they don't know what their brief is and they want to invest, then they can work with someone like me with those extra credentials where I can help them develop a brief, and then I go into the marketplace and I do everything for them from end to end. And you know, the reality is that people have got different budgets they're working with. I know I work with clients who could have a budget of $300,000, and there are buyer advocates who won't touch clients like that because they don't think they're going to make enough money out of it, or they don't know how to work in that market because they don't have expertise or experience in it. So, you know, it goes the full spectrum. I personally will work with clients who may not have a lot of money because I honestly believe that they need to be protected. They can't afford to get it wrong. They have one chance to get it right. And I would prefer to help them get it right than the risk of them going into the market and with that one opportunity they make a mistake. Having said that, someone could have $1 million and we either buy one property for them or we might split it into two and balance their portfolio depending on what the structure is. So look, buying property is complex. Investing in real estate is complex. Selling property is complex. Don't ever believe anyone who tries to dumb it down and oversimplify it. They're probably trying to flog you something. And it's highly likely it could be one of these apartments off the plan that we're going to talk about in terms of the crisis going on in the industry at the moment with that.
Just remind people that you're invited to give us your questions and your comments. You can type them into the chat box or the Q&A panel. Demel's has actually put in a comment and a question. She says she agrees with basically what you're saying. Miriam, so scary with the property shark, she says, and poses the question, shouldn't there be a royal commission into these companies?
Look, they probably should, but the reality is if you look at every politician and the amount of donations they get from developers to their campaign funding when it comes to election time, it's highly unlikely. Yes, it absolutely, absolutely should. I absolutely believe that anyone who's spruiking any type of property needs to be qualified. Too many real estate agents and project marketers and spruikers are giving investment advice, which isn't investment advice or property advice. It's actually sales advice. People get suckered into it. They make bad decisions. They don't truly understand that they're dealing with someone who does not represent their interests, no matter how nice that person is. They do not work for you. Their job is to flog as much property as they can, make as much money for their vendor. They do one transaction with you, they're out of your life, they don't care the consequence. And that's evident now by all those people that have bought these off the plan properties that are now new, that have been built poorly, and they're suffering the consequence. So when people say to me, well, why would I engage you versus doing it myself? That's a perfect example of the risk associated with doing it yourself. And again, I'll talk about some of that in the free chapters that I'm happy to provide people with at the end of the seminar as well. So yeah, look, it's like anything. Property is an asset class. It should be regulated where only qualified people give advice. There should be a royal commission into it, but we'll see.
Gurpreet has posed a question which probably leads in nicely to the next part of your presentation, and is asking, why are off the plan apartments so risky?
Yes. Okay, so I've written about this in my book, Property Prosperity, and the reason it's the highest possible way to buy property is because it's not tangible, it's a concept. Until it's built, a lot of things can go wrong. So there is developer risk. The developer might be inexperienced and they might go broke before it gets off the ground. They might not get the funding or the lending. Building risk, which is evident with what we're seeing now. And this is in relation to the privatisation of the issuing of certificates of occupancy. We had it go from being government regulation to privatised, and now there's a massive consequence, and I'll explain that a little bit more. There's finance risk when someone buys off the plan. All well and good in a rising market, you know, you buy at this level and you think it's going to go to that, but when the market suddenly softens like it did a couple of years ago, all of a sudden people's properties went from being valued here to there, and the difference between, if they couldn't find it, they were in default of contract, they're getting sued by developers, and then all sorts of consequences transpire. So, financing is a risk. We see what's happened in the finance side of things in recent years, and those people that bought off the plan 3 years ago who think they would automatically qualify for finance have been finding out they can't. They also can't settle on their properties as a result of that. So buying house and land packages, buying apartments, buying townhouses, anything off the plan will always have a higher risk associated with it than if it's there, you can see it, it's tangible, you can touch it, you can get a due diligence done, you can do a building and pest report. So personally, I never buy new, I never buy off the plan for those reasons. I only buy established property for clients that's investment grade and has a high land value, because I can do all of that due diligence, and if there's an issue, we either renegotiate or we walk away and we find another property, but you can't do that with an off the plan property.
Okay, so the risks and your headline on the slide on the screen, cracking up, is pretty much speaking very directly to one of the biggest risks that's emerging more and more, particularly in Sydney, it seems, this year. And it's become a massive issue which is impacting on the broader market, I think.
Yeah, look, it's just shameful. It's displacing tenants. It is putting apartment owners into crisis. It has become a legal battle between owners corporations and builders, and then, you know, builders are typically trying to liquidate themselves and walk away. Then you've got issues with insurers not paying out because they're passing it off onto someone else being responsible. So there was a program last night, 2 nights ago, on Four Corners, and it was called Cracking Up. And some of the evidence that came up in that is that certainly in Victoria, there's 74% of new builds within the last 5 years have got problems, and it's higher in Sydney. Now, this has come about largely because of the privatisation of the issuing of certificates of occupancy. As I said, once upon a time it used to be government regulated, then they decided to privatise. They created the rules and they softened some of the criteria of what was required to sign off a building. So nowadays they only require 1 out of 10 bathrooms to be checked in an apartment building, only 1 out of 20 electrical points. They've been importing Chinese products and building materials that don't meet code. You know, they have, developers have not listened to the advice of the builders. You know, I heard of one story where a union member who was a concreter was trying to talk to the developer about the fact that the mix wasn't going to be strong enough for a structural foundation, and he was actually sacked. And there's a whole lot of covering up going on because you've got these people issuing these certificates who are given a lot of work by these developers doing shoddy jobs, and they want to pass it so they can get another job next time round. And there are so many areas where it's fallen apart. And one of the biggest issues is the rules and regulations just haven't been enforced like they should have been. So this is massive. This is just shameful and despicable that it's transpired, but it's a consequence of the privatisation of it a number of years ago during the Kennett era, and then it happened not long after in New South Wales as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a recipe for corruption to be rife in the system. But I think another part of the problem, Miriam, is that this has happened at a time when there's been actually record building of high-rise apartments, particularly in the biggest cities, for about 3 years.
Yeah.
We had consecutive years of record building. So I imagine it was very, very hard for the certification system to actually keep up with the workload apart from anything else.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. And look, also you've had foreign developers coming in. You know, you've had Chinese developers coming in, bringing their own products. Try suing them when they're based out of China. And, you know, in terms of the definition of an engineer, my understanding is that Queensland is the only state that defines what an engineer is in legislation, and Victoria and New South Wales don't when it comes to this sort of thing. So, look, there are so many areas where it's fallen apart. There is so much that needs to be done to fix it, and there are so many people's lives that are going to be devastated as a result. It is a crisis, and it's just really sad to see.
Yeah. And I think the industry is not showing any signs of having any real idea how to deal with it, and the politicians also. I think they're kind of flummoxed. It's something that's a little bit unprecedented in their experience, and they're not really showing any signs of having clear ideas of a way forward to fix a very serious problem.
It is serious, and it's highly complex, and multiple things need to happen across multiple areas to address it, which is why I think they're struggling. But I can only suggest, going back to what I was saying before, buying anything off the plan is the highest, riskiest way of doing it. And unfortunately, this is a perfect example of one of the consequences of those risks, Look, I honestly believe, this is my thinking, that if anyone's going to be recommending buying property off the plan, they need to have a list of warnings in there about all the things that can go wrong, so that if someone's going to make the decision to buy a property, at least they're aware of that. This is, again, the stuff that I've written about in my book, but it should be legislated that off-the-plan contracts have those warnings in there to highlight and inform prospective buyers of the risk that they're taking on board with the purchase that they're making.
And Gurpreet is posing a question that's relevant to the discussion, is asking, is it the same for new house and land packages? Because we're talking primarily, aren't we, about high-rise apartments, new buildings.
Yeah.
What's the situation in your experience with that completely different field, which is new house and land packages?
Well, again, I don't buy them and I don't touch them because I generally don't believe they're a good investment because they don't have high land value. I would imagine that there's still a certification process to issue a certificate of occupancy. You know, again, the difference here is you're getting someone to come in and certify an individual property, and they should be doing a thorough inspection. But again, it comes down to the buyer making sure that before they settle on a property, they have a building inspector come in and do a defects report. So that's the only way someone can protect themselves in that situation, so that if there are any defects, the builder has a legal obligation to fix those defects within a period of time. Now, you might have to chase the builder time and time again, or threaten legal advice for them to do it, which is another risk with buying off the plan, buying a house and land package. But technically, you have that available to you. But spend the money and do a defects report. It's not cheap, but it's your only insurance policy to make sure that if you bought a lemon in some respect, or it isn't what it should be, or it isn't what you paid for, and they've issued a certificate of occupancy, that's your protection.
Okay. Just going back to something you referred to a number of times during your presentation earlier, and a question came in. You referred to investment grade property. I think some people struggling to understand really what that means. So do you have a definition or a description of what you really mean by that?
So I mean properties that are going to outperform the market. So again, that's the top 5%. And whether or not a property is investment grade is determined by a number of things. The location of the property, where it is within a particular suburb, proximity to amenity, surrounding growth drivers that are going to influence its ability to grow in value, supply and demand considerations, the attributes of the property. I mean, we look at 57 attributes to assess the property individually just on the property alone to determine if it's investment grade, and we rate it. So again, it's not simple. This is complex. This isn't something you learn in 5 minutes and you go off and do a course or sit in a seminar. This is years and years of experience and expertise and knowledge, and understand how to assess an investment grade property versus one that isn't. And if you don't have that, pay an expert to help you. You know, quite frankly, the delusion that people have that it's cheaper for them to do it themselves, as I said before, they will always pay a price. It'll just be poor returns. You know, instead of getting an 8% average return, they might only get 3% average return. And over 10 or 20 or 30 years, they're missing out on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of capital growth. That is the price they'll pay if they try and do it on their own and they don't know what they're doing.
So in terms of being investment grade, it's not speaking to the price. You're not suggesting that a more expensive property is a better quality property necessarily.
No, and look, yes, quality is part of it, but it's not all of it. You know, you can buy, for example, I bought a property for a client recently, regionally, and it was a great little property, and it was a family of siblings that renovated it to flip it, but they totally overcapitalised on it. They renovated it to the equivalent of what they wanted to live in as a home buyer. They overspent on it. They tried to sell it according to a price to recover their funds, which is never the way to do a development or a renovation or a flip anyway. And then it sat on the market for months, did nothing. And I was eventually able to buy it for $30,000 under the bottom of their quote range. And they took a loss on it because they didn't know what they were doing in the first place. So, but that is an unbelievably good quality renovated property that I bought for my client that they now don't have to ever do anything to, because it's literally been redone and it's almost brand new again, and they're going to get great depreciation benefits as a result. So again, you know, it's not just quality. There are a whole lot of other factors and considerations, and supply and demand. You know, people don't understand that the levels, you know, even just the percentage of owner-occupiers in a suburb versus investors in a suburb makes a massive difference to a property's ability to grow in value. So again, highly complex and lots of things to take into account.
You mentioned the number of individual attributes that you look for. Did you say 57? Was that the number?
We look at 57, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you obviously don't want to list them all, and we don't have time anyway, but what are some of the key ones that you might look for?
Yeah, well, look, it varies. You know, if it's an apartment or a villa unit, it's different to a house. So, for example, if it's an apartment in a small group, you know, we want to know the number of properties in that group. We want to make sure there's good land value. We want to know about the aspect. You know, I even go down to the level of detail, and I have bought some investment grade apartments for clients before where they're very unique and they're not being built anymore, and that's an appropriate type of apartment to consider. But I want to know, well, where are the bins delivered? What side of the building does the garbo come at 4 a.m. and crash and smash around, particularly in the CBD, when they're doing bins? So again, you know, these considerations will make a difference between buying well or maybe not buying well. And the other thing that determines if a property is investment grade is there's usually, it has high home buyer appeal. So when it comes to reselling it down the track, you're going to have competition, and you're going to have people that will hopefully get carried away emotionally and pay a premium to buy the property from you. Now that's simplistic, but you know, that's some of the answer towards your question.
Okay. Now, in terms of apartments, some people watching and listening may have gained the impression that you were actually anti-apartment, but I think the tenor of what you're trying to say is you're talking about off-the-plan apartments, and there are types of apartment investments that actually would be tick the boxes in terms of being investment grade, perhaps boutique styles, smaller blocks, character, good locations. Yep. So you do, in fact, buy apartments for your clients.
I do, absolutely. I've got clients who are downsizing and they want to go from their big 4-bedroom house to a smaller 2 or 3 bedroom apartment that's well located in the suburb in which they're living, and there are established apartment buildings that offer that, and those apartments are in demand from people who want to downsize. So absolutely, it's not about never buying an apartment. It's understanding that off the plan is the highest possible risk, preferably buy established, but then when you buy established, you have to understand the fundamentals and criteria of that property that will enable it to continue to grow in value down the track. And also what's really complex nowadays, particularly with a lot of these newer properties that have maybe been built in the last 9 years, I know there are situations this is another thing, I know there are situations where owners' corporations have meetings where there are problems in a particular building. They want to minute it in the meeting minutes, and then someone sticks their hand up and says, no, don't do that, because if you do that, we're all going to lose 30% off the value of our properties. So they don't minute it. They all try and flog and get out of the building. And then the next person coming in is buying a problem that they don't know about because it hasn't gone in the meeting minutes. So again, this is just the risk of not understanding the complexity of what you're buying and not understanding the due diligence of what you need to do.
Okay. I'll just spend a little bit of time. We've got maybe 10 minutes before the hour is up. Talking about this whole issue of people's willingness to spend money on good advice. I mean, it's an issue that's really near and dear to my heart. I guess you could argue that partly I've a vested interest because we seek to make a living selling good information. But what I've noticed in the long years in which I've been doing this is that the truly successful investors are actually quite rare. The vast majority of Australians have investment properties just own one or possibly two, and less than 1% own 5 or 6 or more. Those that are successful, what distinguishes them for me is that their willingness to treat property investment as a business, and with any successful business you need to spend money to make money, therefore a willingness to spend money on good advice, good information, and to surround themselves with qualified people providing input that they need and being willing to pay for it.
Yeah. And look, it's about the experts and the team you have around you. And when I talk to a client, whether they've got a $500,000 budget or a $2 million budget, I always say, number one, my role is to make sure you're not going to make a $500,000 mistake. That's number one. Then I'm going to go out and I'm going to develop the strategy and I'm going to buy you an investment grade property that will outperform the market. So people need to understand it's easier to make a mistake than it is to get it right. And when people aren't prepared to invest in experts, quite frankly, gambling. Now, would you go to Crown Casino and gamble $300,000, $500,000, $800,000? If the answer is no, then for you to buy property without experts along the way who are there to help you reduce risk and maximise return, well then why wouldn't you? It's a form of insurance. And I know people get frustrated because they don't like wasting money on building and pest reports, but I can tell you now, if you spent $500 on a building and pest report and it shows $80,000 worth of problems with the roof, you have not wasted your money. You have spent really well and you've walked away from an $80,000 problem. And I see this happen all the time. I go to auctions. I know that I'm the only one that's done a building and pest report. I know how to factor in the implications of the property. Or I walk away because my client and I have agreed that, no, the risk is too high and we're not prepared to take that kind of contingency on board. Oh, this is something else I need to talk about. And then, you know, somebody else rocks up. They haven't done their due diligence. They haven't bought a report that's passed into them. They're a first home buyer. Then they get manipulated inside because they don't know how to negotiate. And on top of that, they bought a $20,000 problem that they didn't know about either. So I can tell you now, my fee in that case would have been a lot less than the 20 grand that they A, overpaid, and B, didn't know about in terms of the building report. So the other thing, be very careful. If you're dealing with buyer's agents who tell you you need a $10,000 to $50,000 contingency fund for repairs on any property that you're buying, run a mile. I would never suggest to a client that they buy a property with potentially that amount of repairs. And I'm not talking about renovation. I'm not talking about cosmetic updates. I'm talking about repairs. That's just insane advice. And I've heard some competitors telling their clients to do that. And sure, have a bit of contingency that's a few $1,000s to allow for the fact that you're not buying brand new. There are probably going to be little things you need to fix. But gosh, you don't want to be buying a property with $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 worth of problems. That's just insanity.
Demelza poses the question, are you familiar with the US model, where 95% of people use a buyer's agent? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't like the US model. There's an absolute conflict of interest. The fact of the matter is the US model, they take money from the buyer and the seller, and they're not actually loyal to anyone. They have no loyalty to either party because they make money from both sides. So that will never happen in Australia because our regulation doesn't permit it. There is a conflict of interest and you're not allowed to receive money legally from both sides of the transaction here. And if you're dealing with anyone who's doing that, if they're charging you a management fee up front for so-called buyer advocacy, but then they're getting a marketing fee or a commission from the selling agent, they're operating illegally, run a mile. So look, don't compare what we do here to the States. That's never going to come about. You do not ever want someone who's that double agent who sits on both sides of the fence. You absolutely want someone who's clearly in your corner and they will go into battle fiercely for you and they will do everything they can to make sure you get an outcome, but they have to protect your interests along the way. They have to set a cap that's the maximum you're prepared to pay at auction. They have to do that before auction day so that you're not going to be rocking up and being emotional. Because we're here to advocate. You know, advocacy to me is about protecting consumers. You know, I needled the Victorian government on underquoting for a number of years before they finally brought in legislation to change it. I wrote a best-selling book to try and educate consumers about smoke and mirrors and how they need to protect themselves and think about risk profiles and all the rest of it, so they're better informed when they're out there in the market, even if they're doing it for themselves. Speaking of which, before I forget, because we've only got a couple of minutes, obviously up there is how I can help people. If you would like free chapters of my book, the first, I think, 3 chapters in the intro, just go onto my website. I'm going to send you a buyer advocacy checklist as well, which are the questions you need to ask if you're interviewing an advocate and you want to engage their services. So just go under contacts. I'll send you the buyer agency checklist. I'll send you the free chapters. Just make sure when you fill in all your details under that contact section, you won't see the image of the book there, by the way, but just tick other, put free book chapters in there, shoot me the email, and then I'll send you the attachment for that. Please read it. It's really important because you're going to get a lot out of it.
Okay. And people, if people just have a general inquiry that don't want to follow up, they think maybe they want to make use of your services.
Yeah, they can also tick free consultation, or they can tick that they're interested in other stuff here. I've actually worked with a lot of hotspotting clients and I've been getting fantastic testimonials from them as well. So if anyone wants to know who from your group have worked with me, I can show them the sort of properties I've been buying them and their feedback as well. So happy to offer anyone a free consultation. Happy to send you all copies of those 3 chapters in my book. And if anyone wants help, we can definitely help you in and around Melbourne and regional Victoria. Regional Victoria is a very hot market. I think, Terry, I talked before about having to change strategy. You know, I know when I was buying in Ballarat, and I've been buying there for 7 years, that I could go up one day, look at 12 properties and take 2 or 3 weeks to negotiate to get an outcome. Nowadays, sometimes I'll go up to Ballarat and back again to look at one property. And if it meets the brief, I do all my due diligence and I have an offer in, you know, within 24 hours. And that's a consequence of high demand, low supply, and having the expertise and the ability to get that kind of result for a client. So again, if anyone would like some assistance, feel free to get in touch. We'd love to go help you.
And it's also pertinent that you mentioned Ballarat. You're not just Melbourne bound. In fact, you're probably spending a lot of time outside of Melbourne in markets like Bendigo and Ballarat.
Yeah, Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong. We can help anyone who's wanting to buy there.
Yeah, Gilbert did pose the question, and it's perhaps some of those locations are a relevant answer to his question. He was asking for an example of an area which will have good capital growth in the next 5 years, where you can buy for under $500,000. Now, I know that's quite difficult now in Melbourne, given the recent price escalation, notwithstanding the correction that's followed in some areas.
Yeah.
But those regional Victorian markets are a pretty good answer to some of those questions, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely for that budget. And if you want a balanced strategy, and by balanced, I mean a mixture of capital growth and cash flow so that you're getting a bit of each. One thing I will say, if you are going to buy in any of those areas, it's still really important to know where to buy, where not to buy, what to buy, where to stay away from, and have all that local intel, because it's just as risky buying in a regional centre as it is buying in Melbourne's metro. You need to understand those growth drivers again. You need to understand the attributes. You need to understand that locally, you know, Ballarat's very different to Melbourne. The things that appeal to people in Melbourne don't appeal to people necessarily in Ballarat. You don't have people wanting to buy property in Ballarat because they want to be close to the cafe lifestyle. That's not the driver for them. There are different drivers and there are different tenants with different needs. And if you don't understand your tenant demographic and you don't understand your future buyer demographic, then it's very easy to make mistakes in regional areas as well. So just be aware that there's complexity there too.
I think the greatest danger for people out of Melbourne going to those regional markets is looking at a property that's priced in $300,000 perhaps, and assuming that, hell, that's a bargain, I'll buy it, and not understanding that it may appear cheap, and in actual fact it's overpriced.
Exactly.
Because of the relative pricing between the two markets.
Exactly, and I see a lot of that. I see Melbourne buyers overpay all the time because they're comparing it to a Melbourne market, not a Ballarat market. So again, for me, having been buying there over the last 7 years, I know exactly what the median is, or rather what value I'm going to get for my clients with different price brackets in different suburbs. And there are certain suburbs that I'll avoid, and there are certain suburbs that I'll target, particularly according to their budget and their strategy. And it may be they've got a renovator strategy or a developer strategy. It may be that they've got a low risk profile or a moderate or high risk profile. So I'll pull all of that together in the strategy for them. And then that dictates what I'm looking for and where, and what the nature of the property is. And yeah, it's all encompassed. So, but generally, Melbourne buyers or interstate buyers will frequently overpay. And again, they pay far more than what the cost of my service would be to engage me and get me to do all the work. So, yeah, that is a mistake people tend to make as well.
Okay. Well, look, we're just almost exactly on the air, Miriam. So it's probably a good point to wrap up. And with the slide on the screen, which is alerting people watching and listening how they can follow up if they'd like to have a further conversation with you, perhaps take advantages of the services you provide, your years of experience and expertise at the coalface of the industry. Don't forget that there's that offer from Miriam also of the free chapters of a book for free, where you can gain valuable information about some of the key factors.
And the buyer's agent checklist, which I'm happy to send you. So if you're interstate and you're wanting to interview a buyer's advocate there, use the checklist. Or ideally, if you want to, you can also contact me and I can refer you to an interstate buyer's advocate, because I do know who the good operators are and I do know who the members are of REBA that I would refer to. So feel free, if you're wanting help there, I can happily help you as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Miriam, for a wonderful webinar session. We've talked about wide-ranging topics, but all highly relevant in the current situation. We've talked about the current market. We've talked about the charlatans out there misrepresenting themselves as buyers advocates. We've talked about some of the off-the-plan apartment problems. And in particular, we've talked about the benefits of having qualified, skilled professionals on your team, such as a good buyer's advocate. Thank you again for a valuable information session, and I urge people who are watching and listening to follow up by getting in contact with Miriam at Property Mavens.
Fantastic, Terry, thank you again for having me. It's always,
welcome.
Always fun.
And remind everybody who registered and perhaps who is listening and watching and may want to perhaps go over it again, we will send a recording of this presentation to everyone who registered today. Okay, that's it. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. Thanks again, Miriam, and thanks everybody who participated as watchers and listeners. Bye for now.
Bye.